Chapter 1. The Night My Family Locked Me Out. I was 16 when my sister framed me and my family locked me out of the house during a freezing storm, calling me a liar while they stayed warm inside. And that night I nearly died on an icy road after a car lost control. But the woman behind that wheel turned out to be the doctor who took me in when my own family would not. And while everyone in town believed my sister's story, the truth slowly started unraveling through a school investigation that exposed the fake messages she created. And years later, I returned to that same town, not as the girl they abandoned, but as a lawyer representing abused children, standing on the stage of the same high school where it all began, while the family who once called me a liar sat in the audience realizing the truth they tried to bury had finally caught up with them. I was 16 the night my father closed the door on me while a storm ripped through the hills outside Cedar Hollow, Pennsylvania. In towns like ours, people respected storms. When the sky turned the color of dull metal and the wind started pouring down from the Allegheny ridges, everyone paid attention. Grocery stores shut their doors early. The gas station lights stayed on all night. Parents called their kids home before dark. That night, the weather radio warned about freezing rain and high winds. By sunset, the maple trees along our street were already bending toward the road. Everyone in Cedar Hollow stayed inside. Everyone except me. I was standing on the front porch of our house with rain soaking through my sweatshirt when my father told me to step outside. "Go stand out there until you decide to tell the truth," he said. Behind him, my younger sister Marissa sat curled on the couch crying into a blanket. My mother stood in the hallway with her arms folded across her chest. She looked uneasy, like she wanted to say something but had already convinced herself not to. I kept repeating the only sentence that mattered. I did not do anything. My father shook his head slowly. "You need to stop lying, Elena." His voice had that final tone I knew too well, the tone that meant he had already chosen what to believe. An hour earlier, Marissa had told them everything, or at least the version she wanted them to believe. Marissa was 14, 2 years younger than me, and she had always been the center of gravity in our family. Teachers adored her. Neighbors called her sweet. The pastor at our church used to say she had a gift for kindness. Growing up, people described Marissa with words like sensitive and special. They described me with words like responsible. Responsible was just a polite way of saying invisible. That evening, Marissa told our parents that I had been humiliating her at school for weeks. She said I had been sending cruel messages about her to girls in her class at Cedar Hollow High. Then she showed them screenshots. In the images, someone using my name wrote that she was fake, attention-hungry, desperate for boys to notice her. The words were ugly. When I first saw them, my stomach dropped. They looked real. Too real. I tried to explain that someone must have edited them, but my father had already grabbed my phone. He stood in the middle of the living room scrolling through it while the rain started tapping against the windows. He did not find a single message like the ones Marissa showed him. That did not matter. "You probably deleted them," he said. Marissa wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Then she slowly rolled that sleeve upward. A deep purple bruise covered the inside of her forearm. "She grabbed me in the hallway today," Marissa whispered. My father looked at me with a mixture of anger and disappointment that felt heavier than the storm outside. "Why would you do something like this to your own sister?" he said. I tried to speak, but the words tangled together. "I never touched her. I never sent those messages." But Marissa had already built the story, and my father had already decided how it ended. Looking back now, I know the real chain reaction started earlier that afternoon. School had just ended, and students were flooding through the hallways. I was standing at my locker when Ethan Walker stopped beside me. Ethan was the kind of guy people trusted without knowing why. Quiet, thoughtful, steady. For weeks, he had been walking with me after class. That afternoon, he leaned against the locker next to mine while I gathered my books. "You coming to the basketball game Friday?" he asked. I laughed and told him I was terrible at school events. He laughed too. Across the hallway, Marissa was watching. She noticed the way Ethan waited for me. She noticed the way he listened when I spoke. Later that day, something strange happened in the girls' locker room. One of Marissa's friends saw her sitting on a bench with her phone open. A photo editing app glowed on the screen. Marissa was cropping what looked like a screenshot. When her friend asked what she was doing, Marissa quickly locked the phone and smiled. "Just fixing something for a post," she said. No one thought about it again. By that evening, those screenshots had become proof. Back on the porch, the wind pushed hard against the door as my father stepped backward into the house. "Go outside and think about what you did," he said again. Then he told me he needed time to calm down. I believed him. I stepped on the porch. The moment I did, the door closed. A second later, I heard the lock click. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at the wood grain of the door. I knocked once, then harder. Rain pounded the porch roof and spilled down the steps in sheets of silver water. The maple trees along our driveway twisted in the wind. Through the living room curtains, I could see shadows moving inside the house. They were still there. They just weren't opening the door. For a moment, I thought my mother might come. I imagined the door unlocking. But the minutes passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, my hands stopped knocking. The cold had already started creeping through my clothes. I stepped off the porch and onto the gravel driveway. The storm siren from downtown Cedar Hollow wailed through the wind. Our house sat at the edge of town, where the road curved through a narrow valley. Storms funneled through that valley like water rushing through a pipe. The pavement was already slick with freezing rain. I started walking. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stand outside that locked door any longer. The wind shoved against my back. Thunder cracked somewhere over the hills. The street lights along the road flickered through the rain. Every few seconds, lightning turned the world white. I pulled my hood tighter and kept moving. My shoes slipped once on the wet asphalt, then again. The road ahead was empty. No houses, no cars, just wind and rain. Then headlights appeared around the curve, bright and sudden through the storm. For a moment, everything went quiet except for the sound of tires sliding across the wet pavement. The car slammed the brakes, but the road had turned to ice. The car fishtailed sideways. The headlights flooded the road with blinding light. Through the windshield, I saw the face of a woman gripping the steering wheel, her eyes wide with fear. The car spun toward me. I tried to step back, but my foot slipped on the frozen pavement. The world tilted. The last thing I remember was the sound of metal scraping across the road. Then the impact came, and everything went dark. Chapter 2. The Truth No One Wanted to Hear. The world returned in pieces. First, the sound. A steady beeping somewhere beside my head, slow and mechanical, like a clock that refused to stop. Then the smell reached me. Clean air mixed with antiseptic and something faintly metallic. When I forced my eyes open, the ceiling above me was white and unfamiliar. For a few seconds, I could not remember anything. Then the road came back. The storm, the headlights, the moment the car spun toward me. Pain spread through my ribs when I tried to breathe deeply. "Easy," a woman said beside me. A nurse leaned over the bed, adjusting the blanket around my shoulders. "You're at St. Matthew Regional Hospital in Altoona, Pennsylvania," she said gently. "You were brought in last night after a traffic accident." My throat felt dry. "The driver," I whispered. "She is fine," the nurse said, "and she has been asking about you since the ambulance left." A few minutes later, the door opened quietly and a woman stepped into the room. She looked to be in her early 50s, with tired eyes and dark hair pulled back neatly. She carried the calm focus of someone used to long nights and difficult decisions. "Hello, Elena," she said softly. "I'm Dr. Claire Bennett." Her voice triggered the memory immediately. "You were driving the car." She nodded. "Yes, and I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." She pulled a chair closer to the bed. The storm turned the road into black ice faster than anyone expected last night. I had just finished a trauma shift and was driving home when you appeared in front of my headlights. She paused. I hit the brakes, but the car started sliding. You were unconscious when the ambulance arrived. I stared at the ceiling for a moment. Lucky timing, she added gently. If the accident had happened a few seconds later on that curve, things could have been much worse. Lucky was not the word that came to my mind. Later that morning, another woman entered the room carrying a thin folder. She introduced herself with the kind of calm tone that made people listen. My name is Laura Jennings. I work with Blair County Child Protective Services. She sat in the chair Dr. Bennett had used earlier. Hospitals are required to notify us when a minor is involved in certain types of incidents, she explained. Her eyes studied my face carefully, especially when that minor was outside alone during a severe storm warning. I already knew where this conversation was going. Why were you walking along Route 17 last night? She asked. My voice came out quieter than I expected. My father locked me out. Laura Jennings did not react immediately. She simply wrote something down inside her folder. Can you tell me what happened before that? My sister told our parents I had been bullying her at school. Did you? No. She nodded again and kept writing. Did your parents know you were outside when they closed the door? Yes. The room fell silent. A few hours later, I heard familiar voices outside the hospital room. My father walked in first. He looked uncomfortable standing next to the bed, like he had stepped into a place where he did not belong. My mother followed behind him, but stayed close to the doorway. How bad is it? My father asked calmly. A concussion and bruised ribs. She will recover. My father nodded once, the way he did when reviewing paperwork at work. That is good. Laura Jennings stood in the corner of the room, observing everything. My father noticed her and frowned slightly. And you are? Laura Jennings, from Child Protective Services. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. She explained briefly that the hospital had contacted CPS because of the circumstances surrounding the accident. My father repeated Marissa's story exactly the way he had told it the night before. Cruel messages, harassment at school, the bruise on her arm. He spoke with the confidence of someone convinced he already knew the truth. My mother finally spoke. Marissa was terrified last night, she said quietly. Laura Jennings listened carefully. Then she asked a simple question. Did either of you attempt to contact Elena after she left the house? My father hesitated. We assumed she went to a friend's house. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. While that conversation unfolded inside the hospital, something very different was happening back in Cedar Hollow. Rumors had already begun spreading through the halls of Cedar Hollow High. Several students noticed something strange about the screenshots Marissa showed everyone. The timestamps didn't match the actual message history in the group chat. One girl scrolled through the conversation thread and realized entire sections were missing. Another student remembered seeing Marissa in the locker room earlier that day, editing something on her phone. Ethan Walker heard about it during lunch. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head. Those messages never sounded like Elena. Later that afternoon, he found Marissa near the gym entrance. Did you fake those screenshots? He asked quietly. Marissa crossed her arms. Why would I do that? Because they're not real. Her expression hardened. You don't know what you're talking about. But doubt had already begun spreading. 2 days later, another student discovered something even worse. A screen recording saved accidentally on Marissa's phone. The video showed her switching between accounts while editing the message thread. The truth was starting to push through the lies. Back at the hospital, Laura Jennings finished her conversation with my parents. For now, Elena will remain under observation while we review the situation, she said. My father did not argue. He simply nodded. We will talk about this later, he told me. My parents left less than 20 minutes after arriving. The door closed behind them, and the room felt strangely larger. Dr. Bennett remained. She pulled a chair beside the bed again. Families make mistakes sometimes, she said quietly. I stared at the ceiling. Some mistakes feel permanent. She studied my face for a moment. Where will I go when I leave the hospital? I asked. Dr. Bennett glanced toward Laura Jennings, who was reviewing her notes near the door. Sometimes the safest place is not where someone started, she said carefully. Laura Jennings closed the folder in her hands and stepped forward. We are still working through that question. She looked toward Dr. Bennett. Then she said something that would quietly change the direction of my life. There may be another option we can consider. The room fell silent as both women looked at each other. For the first time since the accident, the future felt uncertain in a completely different way. Chapter 3. The Stranger Who Became My Family. Morning came slowly, the kind of quiet morning that feels almost unreal after a night that changes everything. When I opened my eyes, sunlight was already filling the hospital room. The storm that had swallowed the town the night before was gone. Outside the window, the sky looked pale and calm, as if nothing terrible had happened. For a moment, I lay still, trying to understand where I was. Then the memory returned. The road, the spinning headlights, the sound of metal scraping across wet pavement. My ribs ached when I shifted. A chair moved beside the bed. Dr. Claire Bennett stood up and stepped closer when she noticed I was awake. She gave a small, relieved smile. "Good morning, Elena." "Morning," I said quietly. She studied my face the way doctors do when they are measuring more than just physical injuries. "How is the pain?" "Manageable." "That is a good sign." A few minutes later, Laura Jennings arrived again, carrying the same thin folder she had been holding since the day before. She sat beside the bed and spoke gently. "We have been reviewing your situation carefully." I waited. "Your parents still insist they believed you went somewhere safe after they locked the door." The sentence hung in the air. Dr. Bennett crossed her arms near the window. Laura continued, "Because of what happened, we cannot return you to the house immediately." I already understood what that meant. "So where do I go?" Laura glanced briefly toward Dr. Bennett. "There are temporary placement options." Dr. Bennett stepped forward. "I may be able to help with that." Laura nodded slowly. "You mentioned that yesterday." Dr. Bennett looked at me. "I have an extra room in my house. It is quiet, and the hospital is nearby if you need follow-up care." Laura folded her hands together while thinking. "We would need to complete a temporary guardian approval, background checks, a home visit." "I expected that," Dr. Bennett said. Then Laura turned toward me. "Elena, how would you feel about staying with Dr. Bennett for now?" The answer came easier than I expected. I would feel safe. 3 days later, I left the hospital. Dr. Bennett drove us through narrow Pennsylvania back roads that curved through frozen hills and small farms. Snow still clung to the ground in patches where the sun had not reached yet. Her house stood near a small lake about 20 minutes outside Altoona. It was not large, but it felt peaceful the moment we stepped inside. Warm light filled the living room. Tall bookshelves covered one wall. A kettle hummed quietly in the kitchen. Dr. Bennett set my bag near the stairs. "You can use the room upstairs at the end of the hall." I walked slowly through the house. The quiet felt unfamiliar. "You do not have to worry about anything here," she said gently. "I'm not used to that," I admitted. She smiled softly. "You will be." The first weeks passed slowly. Trauma makes time behave differently. Some days felt endless, while others disappeared before I noticed them. Dr. Bennett created simple routines that helped me feel steady again. Breakfast at 7, school assignments at the dining table, evening walks along the frozen lake when the wind was calm. One afternoon, we stood together at the edge of the water, watching thin ice shift along the shoreline. "You are thinking about something," she said. "Everything," I answered. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Laura Jennings visited the house regularly those weeks. Each visit included more questions and small updates about the investigation. One afternoon, she arrived with news. The school has been reviewing the message screenshots your sister shared. My stomach tightened. And? There are inconsistencies. Dr. Bennett glanced toward me. Laura continued. Several students noticed the timestamps do not match the actual group chat records. That was the first moment I felt the truth beginning to move. 2 days later, my phone rang. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Ethan? Yeah, he said. His voice sounded cautious. I heard what happened. I'm okay. I didn't believe her story, he said quickly. What do you mean? When your sister showed those messages, something felt wrong. I sat down at the kitchen table. So you told someone? I talked to the vice principal yesterday. What did Marissa say when you confronted her? Ethan hesitated. She told me to stay out of it. Did she threaten you? No, but she looked nervous. That conversation started something bigger than either of us expected. Within days, the rumor spread through Cedar Hollow High. Students began looking closer at the screenshots Marissa had shared. One girl compared them to the actual group chat history and noticed missing sections. Another student remembered seeing Marissa editing something on her phone in the locker room earlier that week. Then, the real mistake appeared. A student found a screen recording accidentally saved on Marissa's phone. The video showed her switching between accounts while editing the message thread. Laura told us about it during her next visit. The evidence confirms the screenshots were manipulated, she said. Dr. Bennett placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. But the strange thing was that the news didn't feel like victory. Life in the quiet house by the lake had already started to reshape my world. One evening after dinner, Dr. Bennett and I sat in the kitchen with mugs of tea while snow drifted outside the window. You are different from when you first arrived, she said. I feel different. In a good way? I think so. She leaned back in her chair. Sometimes people discover their real strength after something breaks. I stared out across the dark frozen water. For the first time since the storm, my future no longer felt like something I had lost. But somewhere back in Cedar Hollow, the truth about my sister was still spreading through the town, and when it finally reached my parents, everything would begin to change again. Chapter 4. The Life They Never Expected. The truth moved through Cedar Hollow faster than anyone expected. In a small town, stories do not travel in straight lines. They move through grocery store aisles, church parking lots, and quiet conversations between neighbors who have known each other for decades. Within days, the version of events that had turned me into the villain began to collapse. Students started asking questions. Teachers started noticing details that had not made sense before. And eventually, the school administration had no choice but to investigate. Most of what I learned about those weeks came through updates from Laura Jennings. One afternoon, she sat across from me at Dr. Bennett's kitchen table with a folder open in front of her. The winter sun was shining through the window behind her, reflecting off the frozen lake outside. The school finished reviewing the evidence, she said. I kept my hands folded in my lap. And? Laura looked directly at me. Your sister admitted she altered the screenshots. The words settled slowly into the room. Dr. Bennett leaned against the kitchen counter nearby. What consequences are they considering? She asked. Laura closed the folder carefully. She lost her leadership role on the student council, and the scholarship committee withdrew several nominations. I nodded once. The news did not feel like victory. It felt more like the world quietly correcting itself. Laura hesitated before adding something else. From what we understand, things at school have changed for her. What do you mean? I asked. Students have started distancing themselves. Trust is difficult to rebuild once it is broken. The sentence stayed with me long after she left. Life moved forward in small steps after that. The school district arranged for me to complete the rest of my classes through a combination of tutoring and online coursework. Dr. Bennett turned our dining room table into a study space covered with textbooks and notebooks. One evening, we sat there reviewing college applications while snow drifted quietly outside the window. "You keep returning to the same 3 schools," she said. "I am not sure which one makes the most sense." She studied me for a moment. "What kind of life do you want to build?" The question felt larger than anything on the application forms. "I want to help people who feel trapped," I said. "Children who do not have anyone standing beside them." Dr. Bennett nodded slowly. "Then choose a path that gives you the tools to protect them." The decision became clearer after that. Graduation arrived the following spring. Cedar Hollow High School looked exactly the same as it always had, but the way people looked at me had changed. The auditorium lights felt bright against the polished wooden stage. Rows of families filled the seats, while the graduation class waited backstage in long black robes. Dr. Bennett sat near the front row. Laura Jennings had sent a bouquet of white lilies earlier that afternoon with a handwritten note that simply said she was proud of me. When my name was called, the applause echoed through the room. Principal Robert Langley shook my hand as I crossed the stage. "I should have paid closer attention earlier," he said quietly. "I'm glad the truth came out." "So am I replied. For a moment, I scanned the crowd. Dr. Bennett was smiling, her eyes bright with pride. Seeing her there made the entire room feel different. After the ceremony, she wrapped her arms around me in a brief, warm hug. "You worked hard for this," she said. "I had help." Later that evening, we sat on the back porch of her house watching the lake grow darker as the sun disappeared behind the hills. "You are ready for the next chapter," she said. "I hope so." "You are stronger than you think." That fall, I left Pennsylvania for the first time. Franklin Harbor University sat along the edge of Boston Harbor, where the air smelled faintly of salt and the streets were always busy. College felt like stepping into a completely different world. The campus was larger than my entire hometown. Students came from cities and states I had only seen on maps before. During my first semester, I declared a major in political science. Not long after that, I added a legal studies concentration. The decision felt natural. One afternoon during my sophomore year, I visited Professor Elaine Porter after class. She leaned back in her chair while reading one of my essays. "You write about justice with unusual clarity," she said. "I have personal reasons." She nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered law school?" "I have thought about it." "You should start preparing now," she said. The idea no longer felt distant. Years passed quickly after that. Internships during the summers, long nights in the library, conversations about constitutional law and courtroom procedure that lasted until midnight. Dr. Bennett remained a steady voice through all of it. We spoke every Sunday evening. Sometimes the conversations were short. Other nights we talked for nearly an hour. "You sound tired," she said once during my final semester. "I'm studying for the LSAT." "You will do well." "You always say that." "Because you always prove me right." Law school came next, then the long process of building a career. By the time 2023 arrived, I was working as a junior attorney at Harbor Child Advocacy Center in Boston. Our office represented minors involved in abuse and neglect cases across eastern Massachusetts. Every time a frightened child walked into the office waiting room, I remembered the night I had stood alone outside a locked door during a winter storm. One afternoon, after a difficult court hearing, my supervising attorney, Daniel Rhodes, placed a case file on my desk. "You handled that well," he said. "I remember what it feels like when no one listens," I replied. He studied me for a moment. "That experience makes you good at this work." Life in Boston moved quickly after that. Court hearings during the week, case preparation late into the night. quiet walks along the harbor when the city finally slowed down. Cedar Hollow became something distant, a place that existed mostly in old memories. Then, one autumn afternoon, a letter arrived at my office. The envelope carried a Pennsylvania postmark. For a moment, I simply stared at it. The handwriting on the front looked painfully familiar. When I finally opened it, the message inside pulled a piece of my past straight back into the present. Chapter 5. The Day the Truth Finally Echoed. The invitation arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. At first, I thought it was another case file delivered to the wrong office. My desk at Harbor Child Advocacy Center was usually buried under folders and legal briefs, so an envelope did not seem unusual. But the return address made me pause. Ashbridge High School. For a moment, I simply stared at the handwriting on the front. The letters looked familiar in a way that made something tighten in my chest. I opened it slowly. Inside was a formal invitation asking if I would return to speak at the spring graduation ceremony. Apparently, someone from the district had read an article about my work at Harbor Child Advocacy Center. The story described several child advocacy cases our office had handled in Massachusetts and mentioned my background briefly. The administration wanted a former student who had overcome adversity. I set the letter down on the desk and leaned back in my chair. Through the office window, I could see the Boston harbor reflecting the late afternoon sun. Boats moved slowly across the water, their wakes breaking the calm surface. For several minutes, I did not move. Returning to that town meant walking back into memories I had carefully left behind. That evening, I called the one person whose opinion had guided most of the decisions in my life. Dr. Bennett answered after the second ring. I read the letter aloud. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a short pause. Then she spoke. Some stories deserve to be told where they started. Her words settled the question immediately. 2 weeks later, I found myself driving through the same narrow Pennsylvania roads that had once carried me away from Ashbridge. The town looked almost unchanged. The small grocery store still sat on the corner of Main Street. The old movie theater still displayed faded posters in the front window. Even the maple trees lining the sidewalks seemed exactly the same. But the feeling inside me was different. Years earlier, I had left that place as a frightened teenager trying to survive the aftermath of a single terrible night. Now, I was returning as someone who had built an entirely different life. Ashbridge High School stood at the edge of town just as I remembered it. The red brick building looked smaller than it once had. Inside the auditorium, families filled every seat, while the graduating class waited backstage in their black robes. Principal David Keller greeted me near the podium. "We are grateful you came back to speak with the students," he said. I nodded politely. "It means more to me than you probably realize." As the ceremony progressed, I stood behind the curtain listening to the speeches before mine. Then something caught my attention. 3 rows from the back of the auditorium sat my parents. Time had changed them. My father looked older and more tired than I remembered. My mother sat beside him holding a folded program in both hands. And next to them sat my sister. Marissa stared down to the floor as if she did not want to meet anyone's eyes. For a moment, my heart slowed. The memory of that storm returned with surprising clarity. The locked door, the freezing rain, the long walk down the dark road. Principal Keller introduced me a few minutes later. When I stepped to the podium, the entire room gradually fell silent. I looked out across the crowd of students and families. Then I began with a story. I told them about a teenage girl standing outside her house during a violent winter storm. A girl who had nowhere to go because the people she trusted most had already decided she was guilty of something she had never done. I described the wind that night, the sound of rain against the empty road, the moment when she realized she was completely alone. The auditorium remained perfectly still. Then I told them another story. A story about a doctor driving home after a long shift at the hospital. A woman who could have kept driving past a difficult situation, but instead chose to stop. I talked about the quiet routines that followed: morning breakfasts at a kitchen table, late-night conversations about the future, small acts of kindness that slowly rebuild a life that once felt broken. As I spoke, I could see the realization spreading across the room. The story was not hypothetical. It belonged to me. When I finished speaking, the silence lasted several seconds before the applause began. The sound filled the auditorium and echoed against the walls. After the ceremony, people gathered near the stage to congratulate the graduates. I stepped down from the podium and walked toward the aisle where Dr. Bennett was waiting. She had insisted on driving down for the ceremony, even though it meant several hours on the road. "You handled that beautifully," she said. I smiled. Everything I said started with you. Before we could leave, someone approached from behind. My father. He stopped a few steps away from us, his hands clasped together as if he was unsure what to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady. We did not understand what we were doing back then. I studied his face carefully. The anger I once carried had softened over time, but the memory of that night had not disappeared. "You understood enough," I said calmly. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. Marissa remained silent beside them. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then I nodded once and turned back toward Dr. Bennett. Some conversations do not need to last forever. Outside, the evening air felt cool and peaceful. Graduates laughed with their families across the front lawn while camera flashes lit the twilight sky. Dr. Bennett and I walked slowly toward the parking lot. "You closed a chapter tonight," she said. Maybe I did, or maybe I finally understood what that chapter meant. I looked back once more at the school building before getting into the car. Years ago, I believed my life had ended the moment that door closed behind me during the storm. But the truth turned out to be very different. That night did not end my story, it redirected it. The greatest form of revenge is not forcing someone to regret what they did. The greatest revenge is building a life they no longer have the power to destroy. And if you've ever felt like someone shut a door on you too early in your life, remember something. Sometimes the storm that pushes you out of one life is the same storm that guides you to the one you were always meant to live. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below and stay with the channel for more stories about resilience, second chances, and the quiet strength people discover when life forces them to start again. If you value stories where strength is quiet but unshakable, subscribe.